The difference a few years makes. Just 3 years ago, we were hosting the most important climate summit since the historic Paris Agreement of 2015.
We are digging our own graves.
Yet in this election, you'd be forgiven for thinking some climate change has all but gone away. And yet we've just marked the 12th hottest month in a row. Europe saw its biggest ever wildfires last year. And in 2022, we breached 40 degrees for the first time in the UK.
These are the central issues of our species' history at this point in time.
This is about as urgent as it gets, and the urgency, I'm afraid, gets worse after this.
Our political leaders and politicians more generally simply don't appreciate how much climate change is going to affect voters over the next 5 years.
So why isn't all of this even more prominent in the campaign? The 2020s have been described as the critical decade, and whichever party wins the election, they're going to have to map out our commitments both to nature and to the climate. Leaving it all to 2029, the next election, far too late. We stole a march on decarbonising our economy. UK greenhouse gas emissions down 52% since 1990. We were the first to enshrine net zero in law. Renewable energy now accounts for almost half of electricity production. But experts say we've got to go bigger and faster to get emissions down 68% by 2030 to keep within 1.5 degrees.
So far, we've done about half the job. So half the job from where we were in 1990 to where we need to be in 2050. Now that sounds pretty good, but the next stage of this is the harder stage.
And the concern is from the climate science community that our political leaders are really not taking this seriously, and that unless they do so, frankly, the future for all of us is really rather bleak.
An honest conversation between the public and politicians would accept that there is no choice as to whether or not we're going to face costs related to the environment. The only choice is how we address them.
It is not just the climate in crisis, but nature too. We've ambitious legislation in the form of the Environment and Agriculture Acts passed after leaving the EU. But 1 in 6 species here is threatened with extinction. And we've already lost a fifth of wildlife populations since the 70s.
I think all too often our politicians kind of think of the environment as something that's quite different from health issues or from the economy or from education or the future prosperity of our country. And yet, of course, nature completely underpins all of those.
And yet, the backlash on the margins against environmental action is growing across the world. Indisputable physics and data dismissed by some. Calls for delay or dilution of net zero law re-entering the mainstream. Some pointing to there being other priorities right now. This isn't about party politics, it's about physics and the law. It is the law that we reach net zero by 2050 and cut our emissions every year to get there. It is the law that we halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And with the growing list of international court cases where governments are being legally held to account because of their lack of climate action, whatever politicians might say, they are legally bound to act. There is public support too. Next weekend, thousands due to march in London, calling for nature's restoration. A Savanta and Wildlife Trust poll showing 79% think nature is important for our prosperity and 59% say it's just as important as other issues we face.
Nature is important because it helps us. It's definitely in our power to help it. We just need to really act.
It's almost a bit ridiculous. It's like, when are they ever going to listen?
All echoed in an open letter by 400 scientists telling parties to take ambitious action or face a dangerous and insecure world.
We can't wait another 5 years. This has to be the government that acts upon these issues.
The longer we delay, the costlier it becomes to address these issues. Lost output, losses of property, losses of health, and losses of life.
The message and science are clear. Will politicians respond?
Alex Thompson reporting. Well, the Environment Minister, Rebecca Powell, is with me now. Thanks very much for joining us. On a day you've come here to make the case for the Conservatives on the environment, you see your leader standing on a gas platform, with many people arguing that he's rowing even further back in terms of his language on the environment, attacking Labour's plans saying they're extreme, putting unnecessary demands of green ideology ahead of the needs of British families. It's not ideology, it's science, isn't it?
Yes, it is science, and we've heard in that report about the urgency of tackling the climate crisis and the nature crisis. They're completely and inextricably interlinked, and this is what I spent my whole time in Parliament working on, and our government takes that really, really seriously. And it was us that actually legislated for net zero by 2050, and we got the raft of measures in place to transition us to the renewable energy regime. And on the other side, we legislated to halt the decline of nature by 2030.
You are moving much more slowly than the experts and the scientists say we need to move.
We take expert advice all the time, for example, from the Climate Change Committee, and it is they that have actually said we will always need some gas and some oil. It's their data. At the moment, 70% of our energy comes from oil and gas. Even when we get to 25% from renewables, some will still have to come from
The Climate Change
oil and
Committee
gas.
say we've gone from world leaders to struggling to meet our legally binding targets. Do you feel embarrassed by that?
Wouldn't it be better if we have to have some oil and gas, that it's produced in our waters where we can see what's going on, where we can make sure that the emissions are captured? Otherwise, we're offshoring the whole situation. Like the Labour Party, for example, are just not honest about what they're saying, because
You're not honest about
our
slowing
oil
down,
and
are you? The Climate Change Committee are not happy with the pace of change.
Well, we've legislated, and we will still hit net zero in 2050.
I mean, Rishi Sunak talked today, again attacking Labour's plan, saying they'll push our nation's finances to a cliff edge, hand tyrants like Putin the power to blackmail the UK. Your critics are saying that if your successive Conservative governments hadn't rowed back on so many green policies, we would currently be better able to provide our own energy needs, to shield people's bills and meet the net zero targets.
Well, I would argue that we haven't rowed back. And actually, it's very sensible not to offshore any oil and gas.
Electric
because, of
cars?
course, let's just finish with the oil and gas. If we get some of that from further afield, even the taxes that are paid, over £4 billion worth of taxes under Labour's plans, under their new big energy company, they won't be used in this country. And we have to bring along people with us. We have to look at the cost of living. We have to look at whether people can actually
Rishi Sunak standing on a gas platform today. What is that about? What image is that sending out?
It's just the small amount of energy that we'll still have to get from that. But look at our renewable energy record. We've got the second, third, fourth and fifth biggest offshore wind platforms in the world, and we decarbonise faster than any other developing economy. I think that's a record to be proud of.
I mean, you talk about the link with nature, which nobody disputes. You know, we're one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, and under your government, more species have been added to the red list. If you get back into power, what will you do?
Well, what we've already done, and I was an environmental campaigner, I was an environmental reporter. I went to Parliament to work on this, and look, we took the Environment Act through Parliament, the biggest piece of legislation in 2 decades to go through our Parliament, and it sets us on a sustainable trajectory to do what our children want us to do what we want with the air, the water, the nature and the waste and recycling. And we've got the policies in place, some of which, of course, involve our farmers. So our ELMS, our environmental land management schemes and our sustainable farming schemes, to bring them on board to use less sprays, less pesticides, more pollinators,
there is no doubt as a party,
buffer strips.
Sorry, very briefly, there's no doubt as a party you are worried about reform. Reform have come out today and talked about scrapping net zero targets. Isn't that going to further push you into a corner?
Well, I would say anybody should be worried about what Reform are saying. I mean, they are literally ostriches with their heads in the sand. Not to even recognise the terrible situation about climate change. We understand that. That's why we've got our net zero energy policies in place, and we need to carry on driving them as we do with the nature restoration. It's absolutely critical.
Rebecca Powell, thank you very much for coming to talk to us today. We appreciate it. Well, Labour's Steve Reid, who's the Shadow Environment Secretary, is in Westminster now. Mr Reid, thanks very much for joining us. Rebecca Powell was talking about nature there, not just the climate crisis. How would Labour reverse the terrible nature declines we face?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right to frame it in that way, because after 14 years of the Conservatives, this is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. 50% of our bird species are now at risk of extinction. Every single river is polluted in our country to some extent. Our landscapes are in decline.
And how would you reverse that?
And there are real fears that our children and grandchildren will never experience nature in the way that we do today, or that we did 10 or 20 years ago. And we have to turn the page on that. So Labour has a very clear long-term plan for restoring nature. That starts with cleaning up our rivers. The Conservatives went absolutely soft on the water companies and allowed this pollution.
We've talked to the Conservatives. Just tell us what exactly you plan to do.
Well, what we'll do is put the water companies under special measures so that water bosses who allow that kind of pollution will face criminal charges, and we'll ban the payment of their bonuses until they clean up their toxic filth. We will ban the use of bee-killing pesticides.
So would rivers be clean? You tackle the river problem. I mean, what is your timetable for that?
Well, you know, we haven't been elected yet. I'm going to have to talk to my colleagues about how the legislation should be put through Parliament. But there are other parts of this nature restoration plan. We want to ban bee-killing pesticides that are destroying pollinators, who are such an important part of the ecosystem. Birds are dying off in part because there aren't insects for them to eat because of the use of these kind of pesticides. We want to open up access to nature. We're going to create 9 new national river walks, 3 national forests. We're going to expand nature-rich habitats like
so
wetlands,
very big
peat
plans.
bogs. Yeah.
Very big plans, but how does all of this sit with your other big plan to get Britain building again? Nature decline comes in part from us having taken away their homes. You're planning to build on brownfield sites, often hugely biodiverse. This is going to make the problem worse, isn't it?
Well, people need places to live, and we have some of the highest housing costs in the world because there aren't enough homes. So I make no excuses for the fact that Labour wants to deal with the housing crisis the Tories have left us with.
So you accept that's a trade-off?
No, I don't. No, but what we will do, the Conservatives, Rebecca Powell was talking about the Environment Act that they passed and that we supported. Now, after they passed it, they locked it in a cupboard and padlocked it and have paid no attention to it whatsoever, missing over 90% of their own targets.
But
what we will do with the new housing, Jackie, is we will apply the net gain requirements so that for any nature that is lost, it will be more than replaced elsewhere. It will be compensated for. If you remember, the Conservatives tried to weaken environmental legislation to further pollute water with their nutrient neutrality changes.
Let's talk about your party and the problem.
Build the houses without lowering environmental standards.
The very clear problem for Labour is, for many people, you tore up your green credentials when you U-turned on the £28 billion investment plan. Why should anyone believe that you're truly committed to an environmental agenda now?
It's very important that what we put forward to the British public is affordable. And what Labour is offering at this general election is the biggest action plan on energy and climate ever put before the British public. When we turn on GB Energy, that will be a public company that will direct investment in wind, wave, solar, nuclear power. We can transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy towards a clean energy economy which protects the climate but also cuts bills for households and businesses. So it's promoting economic growth while protecting the climate at the same time. And that is an ambition completely beyond the Conservative Party.
If you talk about ambition, the International Energy Agency says there needs to be a complete halt to oil and gas licences, yet you're not planning to reverse the new licences that the Conservative government have agreed. Why not?
Well, we can't break contractual obligations that have already been committed to, but there will be no new licences of that kind. It doesn't actually help the economy if we keep it wedded to fossil fuels. The vast majority of that of fossil fuels are imported. We're subject to the vagaries of supply chains that can be dictated by the likes of Vladimir Putin. We want to take control of energy in our own country and turn Britain into the world's first clean energy superpower. Clean energy to protect the climate, but also to cut household and business energy bills. It's a bold ambition, but it's one we will pursue.
Steve Reid, thanks very much for talking to us about it today. Now, here's what some of the other parties have been promising on environmental issues.
And that's why it's so crucial that we have a group of Green MPs in the next Parliament to hold Labour honest, push the government to take the action that's needed if we're to address these defining issues of our time.
We're pursuing net zero policies that are self-destructive. Just look at what it's doing to industry. So we want to get rid of the subsidies that are paid to green energy companies by loading taxes on the electricity bills of everybody in this country.
The Lib Dems are going to spend £8.4 billion in retrofitting millions of houses so that they're not wasting huge amounts of energy. We're going to spend more money in making it cheaper and easier to have an electric car, and we're going to improve the national grid and invest in renewables.
And meanwhile, in Wales, Plaid Cymru say they would aim to deliver net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2035, while the Scottish National Party are committed to a pathway to transition to net zero by 2045.